Welcome to Catholic Family News Special Report. Today we have a follow-up, a more, I think, extensive discussion related to the Traditionalist Roundtable we held over the past weekend. If you watch that, or if you do watch it, is about the broad topic of Catholic culture. Today we're going to take an aspect of that surprisingly has become a bit controversial in the past week to 10 days. That is the issue of dancing and Catholic culture. And we're going to have join us two authors who contributed to the discussion that started this online controversy at the Substack Tradition Insanity. First, we're going to be bringing in Dr. Peter Kwasniewski, who our viewers really probably don't need an introduction. You've seen him on our program before. We've published some articles in our paper. He is a doctor, has a doctorate of philosophy, among other degrees, from Catholic University of America. He's an author, public speaker, teacher, and very knowledgeable traditional Catholic. We have joining us, I think, for the first time at Catholic Family News, Dorothy Cummings McLean, who also holds degrees in literature and theology from Canada. She is also a dance teacher. So she will be able to address it, particularly from the aspect of the craft of dancing. So welcome both of you for joining us for this discussion.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
So I'd like to start with a sort of a positive question. I guess in the immortal words of Rodgers and Hammerstein, shall we dance? What is the argument for why Catholics should want to learn to dance or want to learn and pass on the skills, the art of dancing to future generations of Catholics? So make us the case for what's good about dancing.
Dorothy, I would love to hear from you first.
Okay. Human beings have always danced. Dancing is part of every human culture. Dancing is simply movement to music. It's the expression of emotion, usually joyous. There is something to be gained from knowing the steps to our own dances, our ancestral dances, or our community dances, depending on where it is that we live, so that we can join in and dance together, as again, human beings have always done. And indeed, at the earliest centuries, Christians danced in devotion, and in the Middle Ages, Christians danced on pilgrimage. So to be able to know the steps again, so that we can dance according to our ancestral dances, helps recreate the traditional Catholic communities that we wish to create.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just add to that that not only is dancing universal and a natural response to rhythmic music, but it's also a particularly healthy way to get exercise. It's a good physical activity. Everybody needs physical activity. We don't get nearly enough of it in the modern world. It's a healthy form of exercise, but it's especially good for bringing large numbers of people together, both younger people and older people of all generations, so that they have one common activity that they can enjoy together. See, one of the problems that I see is that in modern times, there are so few opportunities for people to get together and have wholesome fun, right? Our society is very atomized, very isolated, fragmented. You know, people very much work in their own little silos or their own little cubicles, and very much, obsessed with what's going on online, which is a virtual reality, even if there are real people out there, contributing to this. And so we have very few communal activities. And in the traditional world, especially, there can be a kind of dourness that we have to fight against, because the modern world is crazy and it's messed up. So there's a lot to be depressed about. And then the church is messed up, and that's even worse, And so you can sometimes, we shouldn't be glum, right? We need to not be glum. We need to have joy in our lives. And obviously supernatural joy is the key. But natural joy and natural celebration and natural festivity is also a really important component. We're not angels. We're men. We're men of flesh and blood.
It's actually a good point because it's funny. Chris Farrar and I do a show over at the Fatima Center, and we laugh a lot. And we've got a couple comments from people like, "You shouldn't be laughing so much." So that drove Chris to give a lecture that I think he's going to publish on why God loves laughter and sort of a study of the mention of how many times God laughed. So it's interesting that you say that we don't want to be dour. We need to have a time for being happy. But I'd like to, and you're both with your backgrounds in philosophy and theology, whenever you talk about a subject, it's important to define your term. And
Absolutely.
sometimes some people may be confuse the modern corruption of something with the thing itself. And this goes
Absolutely.
beyond dancing. So I'd like to talk about, and you alluded to this, Dorothy, when you talked about the steps. When we're
Mhm.
talking about dancing, the benefit of this is not something you can just do. It's just not natural. You just don't stand up and do it. It's something that has to be learned. And to get your reaction, I'd like to quote Alexander Pope about art. True ease in writing comes from art, not chance. He
Mm.
moves easiest who has first learned to dance. So I don't know if you'd like to comment on
Mm.
that by
Yes.
dance we mean something structured and something that must be learned.
Yes, absolutely. Um, it used to be that children would be sent. Okay, I'll qualify this because when I
Yes.
say used to, human history is a long, long time. So
Yes.
I will root it in the 1920s. My grandfather would get extra pocket allowance for escorting his sisters to dancing lessons. Okay, because in the 1920s, still in the 1920s, it was. And let me see. I'm trying to. Oh, their father was an electrician. So
Mm.
even in a blue collar working class home, it was still something that people would do. You would go to your parish hall, or if you were a Protestant, as they were, a church hall, or the Legion Hall, or somewhere where there was dancing, and you would dance the structured dances of the time, which in the 1920s in the United States and in Canada included dances that were being refined by the castles. Okay, like the castle walk, the one step, the waltz. They danced a more modest, what they would call refined version of the tango. Um, these were the dances that my great aunts would have learned in dancing school as children. In Scotland, however, even to this day, children in primary school learn our national dances. I live in Scotland. You can't tell from my accent because I'm from Toronto, but I live in Scotland, and I can assure you that I'm happy to say that children here still learn their national dances, which are dusted off almost every time someone goes to a wedding, which is splendid, splendid. So there's a very strong national dance culture still here, where children learn the steps, which means they can dance with other children, or again, adults from any part of Scotland when they get together for a big celebration, say a New Year's Eve dance.
Mhm. Yes, let me just add to that, right? There's no such thing as a random art form. That's a contradiction of
Yeah.
terms, okay? If you want to write music, you can't just sit down at a piano and play whatever keys. I mean, like a cat walking across the keys. You can't simply play randomly and call that a piece of music. You can't throw together a bunch of pieces of wood and glass and call that a building. It's going to collapse, right? And in addition to being ugly, you can't just write down whatever stream of consciousness occurs to you and call that a poem. Now, unfortunately, in modern times, there are people who would do exactly those sorts of things,
Exactly.
like people who would pile up a stack of toilet paper and put it in a museum and call it, waste. Or I mean, I don't know what, there are all kinds of dumb things that so-called artists do, but none of that is real art. And we know that because art is a discipline of reason by
Mhm.
which some order is put into the thing that the art is about, whether that thing is the order of tones and rhythms and music, or the
Mhm.
order of arches and windows and doors and so forth in
Mhm.
buildings, or verse with rhythm and rhyme. And with dancing, the thing that the art of dancing is putting order into is our motions, right?
Yeah.
So if you just stand up and flail around and gyrate like some people do in a nightclub, you can call that dancing, but it's an equivocation. It's not
Mhm.
the art of dancing. The art of dancing is when an individual with a group, or a group together, or a couple, they follow a certain order, or they follow an order of steps in a beautiful way to achieve a beautiful result. that is the work of art. Art always aims at beauty. And they do that to music that is well ordered as well. So when we're talking about dancing and defending dancing, we don't mean modern nightclub dancing. We don't mean raves. We don't mean mosh pits, right? We mean the waltz, the swing, the English country dancing, the Virginia reel, contra dancing. There are a lot of different terms for these things, but basically we're talking about traditional, social, formal dancing is what we're talking about. And that is an art form, and it's a discipline, and it's a source of joy as people get better at it, right? The better you get at it, the more fun you have with it, right?
Yeah.
So following up on that, because I think both of you mentioned the word emotion, and that dance is an art form based on emotion. Could you explain the difference between the error that the Catholic Church is opposed to, that emotions are bad? The emotions are bad. We're just supposed to suppress emotions, as opposed to the true Catholic understanding of, I think, Peter, maybe your words, regulated or properly regulated emotions.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, St. Thomas Aquinas is famous for arguing against the Stoics, that emotions are not evil. God created them. The emotions are movements that are natural to us. And what we need to do is to put the order of reason into the movements of our, he would say, sense appetites. In other words, the fall has made us unruly, has made our emotions a kind of mess. We tend to overreact. We tend to either go to excess or to defect, to deficiency. And what we really want to aim at is the right feeling or the right passion at the right time, in the right place. Aristotle uses all these qualifications. And how do you do that? The only way you can put order into your passions or your feelings is by repeatedly practicing training. Yeah, there's a kind of training that has to go on, right? You can never learn courage, for instance, if you don't experience risky and difficult situations. If you protect somebody in a bubble, they'll never learn courage because they won't be challenged to acquire it. And the same thing is true with the emotions that go with interacting with the opposite sex, for example. You can't stomp on that and say, go away, never arise, never, you actually have to allow them a healthy outlet and, a well-regulated situation.
And I would not even call it an outlet. I would call it an opportunity. If you have young men and women who, for example, are homeschooled, they don't have a lot of opportunity to speak to other young men and women, except perhaps at church. If they have a dance at which their church community is, they're around multi-generations of people. There are a lot of parents looking out. It's very difficult to get away with bad behavior, should any of them think of it, although I'm thinking they're much more likely to hang back. But in such a circumstance, if you have hosts and hostesses who are very much thinking of hospitality, very much thinking about introducing people, very much breaking the ice, the old-fashioned way in which the young people used to get to know each other, then that gives children a chance, or younger people a chance to meet each other in a safe way. And also, if young men are taught, as I try to teach, are taught how to ask young women to dance, and young women are taught how to accept a dance or how to graciously refuse a dance, then they get training in that. So it's a really fun exercise. Actually, I think it's really hilarious. If I get to tell the boys, okay, boys, come across and everybody ask a girl at the same time. And then the girls have the exercise of saying yes graciously, but girls also have the exercise of saying no graciously, which sometimes they don't say so graciously in the exercise. And everyone laughs. And I hope when the boys are at a dance somewhere and they do ask a woman to dance and she says no, politely or not politely, they will remember the laughter of these exercises and they won't take it so seriously.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think I would add to that we should not underestimate the potential for a well-regulated social dance or ball, if you want to use that expression, to teach politeness, manners, decorum, all of the sort of things that nobody teaches anymore. There used to be finishing schools where people would learn these things. There used to be, there was a whole life, even I would say even in the 1950s, although it was already crumbling at that time, but there was a certain sense of the way things ought to be done.
Mm.
The way that a boy should behave towards a girl, the way that to open the door
Yeah.
or to bow, or just all these sorts of things. Which feminism, I'm sorry, I mean, it's not the only factor, but feminism has been like a nuclear waste, right? It's destroyed so much of this normal this code of interaction. Some of it you could call chivalry, some of it you could call
Mm-hmm.
politeness, whatever you want to call it. And somebody just reminded me the other day that sometimes in dances, I think this was especially with line dances, that the person calling the dance would say at the beginning, reverence your partner, you know,
Yes, yes.
and you were supposed to bow towards your partner. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
what a theologically rich moment
Mhm.
that is, right? It's Yeah, we should be reverencing our partner. We should be reverencing one another,
Mm-hmm.
and this is the kind of thing that no one is going to learn off by himself, scrolling on his doom scrolling on his smartphone. You know?
Actually, to follow up on that, from our years, my wife and I's years of, and we started dance lessons for our wedding, to prepare for our wedding, because we were not even traditional Catholic at this point. We were Novus Ordo, but we didn't want a free for all, just ugly looking wedding. So we took dance lessons to learn to dance properly, and we've done on and off since then. But one of the things I've come to realize about it is it is the most countercultural thing to do against the modern errors of feminism and a lesson in a proper Catholic marriage. And what I mean by that is there's the perfect Catholic balance. So the man has to lead the dance. And in a certain lesson, if he doesn't, it is chaos. If you're just all
Yeah.
doing whatever steps you want. However, there has to be a willing partnership as part of that, because if the man is, and you've seen some people doing this, who's just like literally pushing the woman around, it's ugly. There's no beauty to it. The
Yeah.
beauty of that you have to learn and practice is to lead in a way that someone watching doesn't look like that it's natural, that you're moving as one, although one
Mhm.
is leading. And it's really, to me, as always, I thought of as a metaphor for the proper understanding of Catholic marriage, against the
Yeah,
extremes
that's
of
right.
feminism and the extremes of, like, I'm in charge, you do whatever I say,
Yeah,
caricature of St. Paul is really something you're teaching. But
yeah, that's right. Thomas Howard has a wonderful essay about dancing as a metaphor of marriage, and he says everything you're saying, though he says it with the kind of wonderful, C.S. Lewis style that he has. But if I had the book here, I would read it, but I don't have it. Anyway, that's all
I
true.
I have to look for that. Well, with that, I'd like to jump to one of the objections, just what we're talking about, because we're talking about men and women dancing together. And how would you respond to who I would call the neo-Manichaeans, who say, wait, this means you might have to touch someone's hand. You might have to
Mm-hmm.
hold their hand, and that is a physical touching. That's bad. How would you respond to that?
Dorothy.
Okay. Dirt is matter out of place, right?
Yeah.
So there is wrong touching. There's wrongful touching. There's unwanted touching, and then there's normal, natural touching. If your child falls down and scrapes his knee, or any child falls down and scrapes his knee, it's natural for any adult to examine the knee because the child is hurt. Okay. Um, I there. Another thought I had is of paramedics, for example. In dancing, I noticed dance teachers are very careful to say "may I," which you also, of course, do when you ask someone to dance. You say "may I," and the gentleman puts his hand out, and the lady puts her hand in. Now,
Mm,
that's how it's done. The gentleman offers his hand, the lady puts her hand on his hand, and that is an acceptance with physical touch,
mm,
that I accept your physical touch for this dance.
mm,
Okay, so for people who are worried about consent, there's the consent. You might say that one might argue that it's not that much different for a woman to hold a man's hand and put her hand on his shoulder than for her to shake his hand and clap him on the
mm.
shoulder to say good job. Dance holds are not a lingering caress.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yes, I mean, I think the objector that you're referring to, Brian, or that
Yes.
type of
Yeah,
objector,
Jared.
typically will say something like this: only the married are allowed to touch each other.
Mm,
The unmarried should never touch each other. I mean, the unmarried of the opposite sex.
mhm.
But I don't know where they're getting this from. This has never been the position of moral theology. It's as Dorothy says, it depends entirely on what kind of touching you're talking about. So the moral theologians will talk about the custom of people kissing one another, which in Europe everybody does. Everybody kisses everybody. I mean, it's not a passionate kiss; it's just a polite peck on the cheek or something. But it's there's a kind of puritanical strain that comes up, especially in American discussions,
Yes.
and it is rooted in a very Calvinistic sort of pessimism about human nature and fallen human nature. And I think what it comes down to is, I mean, and this would give Freudians a field day, but it almost comes down to the claim that it's impossible for unmarried men and women to spend time together and to touch each other, even in a controlled and well-regulated and social
Yes.
environment, without experiencing sexual temptation. That's the claim. I've seen it said explicitly.
Yes.
And that is false. That's simply a false claim. It's false experientially. If you talk to people who dance, when you are dancing a line dance or when you're even dancing a waltz, you're caught up with the activity of the dance. You're trying to keep the rhythm of the dance, and it's like doing physical exercise. It's like playing soccer. I mean, it's not the kind of environment where you're going to feel aroused by that kind of activity. I mean, I'm not saying it could never happen. I'm just saying normally in a normal dancing situation, people are actually just fully engaged in this physical activity of dancing, and it doesn't have to mean anything else. You know, sometimes a dance is just a dance, right? That's and that's you see that that's true because mothers will dance with sons and siblings will dance with each other. Sometimes girls will dance with each other. This is not a sexual activity at all.
Yeah.
And to say that it is exactly to commit the error of Freud, which sexualizes everything, right? Any kind of relationship is sexualized. That's an error. I'm sorry to say it, but it's just plain and simple an error.
Mm. No, you're right. And one issue I think is related to your thing about Freud is I think because we're an overly sensual culture in the modern world. I mean, everything is just explicit. There's no rules. That almost I think this is an overreaction.
Yeah.
That and it's interesting. I know in your various articles and responses you've mentioned Pride and Prejudice, which uh, obviously I think the novel is in one of the best English novels ever written, but the BBC production of it, and I'm usually one of the people that thinks books are always better, but the production, the 6 hour one that I think you showed some clips from as well,
Mhm.
is so artistic. And one of the parts of it that has always impressed me artistically is throughout how many hours are up to this point, Darcy and Elizabeth have been developing a relationship, right? And they've
Mhm.
been talking, they've had these encounters, but it's at the ball at Netherfield. And they do this beautifully. When the dance begins, they reach and the camera focuses on their hands touching through gloves, interestingly. But it's the first time there's any specific contact between them.
Mhm.
And it's just a beautiful moment showing when you live in a culture where there are more rules and separations, it actually makes things more meaningful
Mhm.
in an artistic way and more meaningful. And I think it's because we live in a culture where touch has actually lost its meaning or lack of a culture, a just corrupted culture, that there then becomes this overreaction of sensitivity against it. And it's always one of those scenes that struck me. I think it's very beautiful when you see that moment and the camera lingers for almost half a second too long to sort of emphasize this this moment and how human communication can occur non-verbally.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, we don't want our young people to be so awkward
Yes.
in the presence of of the opposite sex that they can't even start a natural and normal conversation. So you
Mm,
need ice-breaking activities.
that's true.
You need the opportunity in a sort of unthreatening social environment for everybody to mingle with everybody else. And that's the way, as Dorothy mentions in her article on my Substack, the norm at a dance is for everybody to dance with everybody, not necessarily every single person, but I mean to have a lot of mingling and mixing, so that it's not people who are sort of coupling off you
Mm.
know, and now they're just this little bubble by
Yeah,
themselves. That's
definitely not.
not the way a social
It's just
dance
not done.
works.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. In fact, that's considered quite
Yeah.
rude.
One of the interesting social aspects of early 19th century dancing are the are elderly ladies, or just say people who feel that they're beyond the age for dancing or don't want to dance, and they watch the dancers, so they know who's danced with who because they're watching. They're part of the community. And if you danced with if a gentleman danced with the same lady twice, or she accepted his dance more than twice, then there would be a lot of talking. So you would really not do that if you didn't want to give everybody reason for comment.
Mhm, mhm.
Yes, Mrs. Bennet would be off whispering to someone
Exactly.
about who oh, they've danced
Exactly.
twice in a row. Yeah, very
Or not
interesting.
whispering, as the case may be.
Yes, exactly. Or not, right.
Yeah.
But so before we get, I want to get to one other significant objection that people have raised. Significant because I think for like with the touch, I think betrays a sort of larger uh, flaw in thinking. But I want to return to my quote from earlier about the King and I, the story of the King of Siam portrayed in the musical. And what I find very interesting about it is when the King of Siam is going to receive the British delegation, he brings Anna in and he says, we have to show them we're not barbarians. We have to show them, we want to show the English that we are a civilized culture. And what he asks her to do is to teach him to dance. And on
Mm.
that, before we leave this negative, what extent do you think almost is not possible to have a fully developed culture if you were to sort of cut dancing out? To what extent is dancing properly understood sort of an essential part of a civilization?
You know, you mentioned Darcy earlier. There's a really interesting that movie. Dancing in that movie is a very powerful metaphor, as you
Yes.
said, of relationship and of community. And in fact, we see also in the same story how dancing leads to evils as well.
Mm.
With was it Lizzie and the the
Lydia.
two, or
Lydia.
Lydia,
Lydia,
the
yes.
the frivolous sisters. Sorry, Liz is the main character.
To
Um,
quote
yeah,
Mr. Bennett, two of the silliest girls in England.
yeah, exactly, exactly. We see how the ballroom dancing with the or the home dancing,
Mm.
leads Lydia astray. Not so much because of dancing, but because she's frivolous, and the dancing
Yes.
gives Wickham an occasion to be the
Mm.
way he is. But remember when Darcy is at the dance and he refuses to dance, and I think he says something like, "Any savage can dance." Doesn't he say
Yes.
something like that?
Yes, you're right.
He's being very very haughty, and he's not going to deign to dance with these lowly country bumpkins as he sees them,
Yes.
right? But in fact, the opposite is the
Yes.
truth. Savages don't dance. At least they don't dance well. They don't dance
Yes.
these social dances, and it's Darcy who has to be broken down to the
Mm.
point where he has the humility to become part of a community and to accept his place as not lofty above everyone, but as really part of a community. And so I see it as he also undergoes a kind of civilizing process. It's different though, because he already is civilized, but it's a sort of
Mm.
there's an impediment there that has to be
Pride,
overcome.
in fact.
Yeah, well, it's the pride,
His
exactly.
pride,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
And so that's I think that's fascinating the way she depicts that.
You're right in terms of a metaphor, because the other metaphor is the other character who is outside of society, in a sense, who is awkward, is Mr. Collins, who is disrupting the natural inheritance of the family, etc. And if there's a scene they do well in that movie as well, where he tries to dance and he's crashing. Liz
Yeah.
says, "Other way, Mr. Collins," right? And he doesn't know the social ritual. And so he is, as part of his comic character, he is always making blunders. He is not,
Yeah.
and the dancing is sort of a metaphor for that. It's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. Well, then maybe if we can turn to some of the objections, which maybe I have heard appeal to some more people than some of these others, and that is quotation. Well, the claim that the quote the magisterium of the church has come out against dancing, and I'm going to quote some really holy saints. St. John Vianney, St. Francis de Sales are two of the most common, and they condemn all dancing. Ergo, infallibility, you're wrong because infallibly they're right and dancing is evil. So trying not to sarcastically mock the position too much, but how would you
Yes.
respond?
Okay, I'll start by saying that there has long been a tension between the pro dancers and the anti dancers in the church. Okay, so I'm not going to pretend that there hasn't been squabbles about this and there hasn't been various condemnations here, there, and everywhere, because there certainly have been. However, there are often distinctions made between immodest dancing. You're not allowed to do immodest dancing, or you're not allowed to do the dances of, to use a euphemism, of dancing girls. Okay. I saw a quote today from the early church in which he says, look, if you dance, don't dance immodestly. So and at the same time, the reason why they are saying these things is because Christians have been dancing, and you know, that there are our forebears in faith, the Hebrew people, also, of course they danced, and so we continued, you know, to dance. And there were some priests, some bishops who had a problem with that, and other priests, other bishops who did not. So it's quite incorrect to say the church has always and everywhere taught dancing is wrong.
Right. No, and I think this raises a much deeper question, Brian, about hermeneutics. About, well, I mean, that's sort of a naughty word for some people, but this, how do you interpret magisterial texts? Well, for one thing, you have to say, what is this magisterial text? What level of authority does it have? They're not all the same. When you have the sacred congregation, what did they call it? Well, anyway, it's the precursor to the dicastery for bishops. Okay,
Yeah.
When you have that congregation at the Vatican sending a letter to American bishops, telling them that priests should not be organizing dances at their parishes, what level of authority does that have? First of all, it's a local document. It's not a universal document. Secondly, even if the Pope allowed it to be sent, it's not from the Pope, right? Thirdly, it specifically says priests should not be organizing these, and if lay people organize them, the priests shouldn't go. But it never offers any penalties for lay people who go. It doesn't say they're public sinners, they should be refused communion or whatever. So when you start, and then you see phrases from the Council of Baltimore like, dances as at present carried on, you know, shouldn't be done, as at present carried on. And apparently Catholic Answers has an article about this. There's a specific warning against the fashions, the immodest dressing that goes on at some of these balls, referring to especially décolleté dresses, right? So when you look more carefully, what you realize is these are targeted interventions with very specific, they're targeting a very specific set of evils. And to go from that to dancing in general has been universally condemned for all time is absurd. I mean, that's it. There's no theological argument there. That's just a simple absurdity. But then there's also the question of the saints. And I talk about this in my Substack article from this past Friday. I revere the saints, all of the saints, but there are thousands of saints over the past 2,000 years, and they have said a lot of things about a lot of topics, and they're very opinionated. And that means that if you're not careful, you can support a lot of positions by quoting saints, right? Even many, many saints, and end up with a false position. Some of the examples I gave are the Feeneites, who can quote reams of saints who say, if you're not baptized with water and the Holy Spirit, you cannot possibly be saved. There's no salvation apart from water baptism, right? Well, that is a position that the church does not hold. That is a position St. Thomas Aquinas refutes. But the Feeneites, some of them at least, still hold that position, right? On the basis of what? Many quotes from many saints, right? And from this or that council. But similarly, I pointed out, you can support the position that the Virgin Mary was conceived in sin or even committed sins on the basis of Basil the Great, John Chrysostom, St. Bernard of Clairvaux, St. Thomas Aquinas, right? I mean, it's amazing what you can show if you cherry pick the saints, right? Yeah. So we have to be very careful and ask, is this view of, say, St. John Vianney, what is really going on? What is he really condemning in 19th century bars?
What is the context?
Exactly. Yeah. And even if St. John Vianney did hold the position that all dancing everywhere was wrong. Is he right about that? He's not necessarily right just because he's St. John Vianney. See what I mean?
Yes.
And so we just have to have the realism to accept that saints disagree with each other about a lot of things, and we have to be comfortable with that, right?
No, it's I find most interesting the people who want to quote councils, and again, outside of a dogmatic definition in the council, they want to just quote a statement a council made and elevate it to extraordinary magisterium. Whereas the same people, if you said, oh, well, hypothetically, if we could say, oh, the Second Vatican Council condemned, dancing.
Yeah.
They would, oh, the Second Vatican Council said it, but if there are 10 other things the Second Vatican Council said, the same people would say, well, that's just pastoral, that's not dogmatic, that's not infallible. But when it comes to this, they'll clip a quote from a different council that bears the same note of authority, and elevate it to the level of extraordinary magisterium.
Right. Yeah. No, in fact, there's a good friend and I were just talking about this recently. He said, for simple-minded people in the traditional movement, they typically have only one rule for magisterial interpretation, and that's if it's before 1960, it must be right, and if it's after 1960, it must be wrong, right? And that's, of course, that's totally simplistic, and it doesn't actually give you the tools you need to work with these sorts of questions. But the other thing that you brought up, which I think is really worth pointing out, is any kind of stance about dancing is a pastoral, prudential, disciplinary question. It's not a doctrinal question. It's not even, I would say, it's not even principally a moral question. It's a question of what kind of dancing with what kind of clothing in what kind of situation are we talking about here? And that's the kind of thing that where there can be different evaluations even at the same time, and certainly there can be different evaluations after 100 years have passed, or if you change some of the circumstances. So if you have Catholic social dances where people are dressed modestly, which is what we should all aspire to, obviously, then the stricture against immodesty at dancing isn't going to apply to us, right? It's a different situation.
Absolutely. And you're right about, understanding moral decisions. There's a lot of lack of clarity on the understanding of principles, moral principles, which are unchangeable parts of the natural law, intrinsic evils, for example, and the application of unchanging principles to what St. Thomas would call contingent matter. And that the even saints, even people who have correct principles, can have disagreements about the particular application in particular circumstances, particularly when it comes to matters of judgment, in terms of not sinful behavior, but is on balance in the circumstances, is this the right choice or not? That two people, there's no clarity of an answer which is correct or wrong, as there is at the level of principle. But I don't think people draw the distinction between those two exercises.
That's right. And let me try to explain how different situations can be. So if you go back to the 17th century, when somebody like St. Francis de Sales is writing, a ballroom dance at that time, if I can use that expression, I don't know if that's technically what they would call it, but a social dance at that time would have been the main opportunity for vanity and intrigue and probably immodesty and certainly seduction, right? If there was to be the society was so tightly structured and so tightly ordered that there was no way a man was going to get access to a woman apart from a dance, right? So your Don Juan type is going to be at that dance, and he's going to be practicing all his subtle and sly arts. And this is exactly the kind of scenario you could imagine a saint being alarmed by. This is not a homeschool dance put on by trad families in the 21st century, right? And whereas now, the seducers who are out there are not at the ballroom dances anymore. I mean, again, I'm not saying it's impossible that there could be some throwback, but it seems to me that now the evil has morphed into many other forms in many other places. And the well-regulated social dance is exactly the place where virtuous people are going to be able to meet and have a virtuous good time together, and maybe even meet a future spouse, or at least become less socially awkward, or whatever the case might be. And to such an extent that it could actually be wrong now not to hold such dances, given the totally changed circumstances in which we're living,
Yes.
uh, as opposed to the 17th century ballroom dance, right? I mean, these are
Mhm.
such different social situations that if you just stop and think about it, you could never just take what somebody said in the 17th century and apply it to what we're talking about right now. Right?
Mm. It's interesting that you mentioned St. Francis de Sales, because one of the passages that people often quote from the introduction of the Devout Life, I think they miss the point of the story, because the correction he gives to the woman is that, and he says you were dancing with a devil, and is that out of embarrassment she didn't wear her scapular to the dance, and he's
Mm-hmm.
saying that this is the problem, that if you're going to go out into any form of society, right, your removal of your scapular out of embarrassment, you didn't want him to see it, is the problem,
Mm.
more that he's emphasizing more than the fact of the dancing, because he says because you didn't remove your scapular, because you removed your scapular, you allowed this opening for the devil, which I think is interesting. People don't put that one particular incident in context.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but maybe if we could sort of maybe move towards wrapping this up. One thing I want to come back to, Dorothy, you mentioned about particularly Scotland. I find it interesting that cultures where Catholicism has been persecuted are ones that actually tend to have worked to preserve their dancing culture. And obviously the Highlands, most of the Scottish dancing is coming from the Highlands. Most people, because they've been brainwashed, forget was a Catholic culture that resisted the English Protestantism in the Highlands, as well as one of the most popular forms of internationally of dancing, Irish um, step dancing, which again was coming out of a culture being suppressed by Protestantism. Whereas, as far as I'm aware, since let's say since the antiquity, the major cultures that have banned dancing have been Oliver Cromwell, the Puritans, who also banned Christmas. So, do you think that there is a connection between Catholicism and dancing, and fear of irrational suppression of dancing and Protestantism?
That when it comes to the Scottish experience, that's very difficult to say. Catholics
Yeah.
are such a small minority here. We're only 15%.
Mm,
The Highlands themselves, amongst those who are still religious in Scotland, the
yeah.
Highlands themselves, I would divide roughly between Roman Catholics and Presbyterians, especially the Free Presbyterians of Scotland, who are known sort of jocularly as the wee priest, the wee
Mm,
priest, and they don't dance, but I would not want to make a claim, especially living as I do on East Coast Scotland, which is very much majority
right.
Protestant, that Catholics own Highland or Ceilidh dancing more than any other group. I think what's much more at play here is the Scottish sense of being Scottish when they're a junior partner in the United Kingdom. So I think
Yeah.
I would say that the failed Jacobite rebellions, plus the romanticization of the romantic failure,
Mm,
probably has more to do with the enthusiastic embrace of the English of Scottish
ah,
culture and the development of such a well-educated Scot as Sir Walter Scott in helping along Scottish cultural artifacts like dance. The Irish, I recently discovered, the Irish Ceilidh actually was revived. When they revived the Irish Ceilidh in the 20th century, they looked to Scotland for what the Scottish had done in the
mm,
19th.
interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know, Peter, if you have anything you want to add on that subject, or
Yeah, well, not on that subject.
no?
I was thinking that one of the controversial issues that comes up is, so this is a more subtle or a more sophisticated objection. I've seen people say that they have no problem with line dancing or with
Mm,
contra dancing
Mm.
or with folk dancing, like English country dancing, that
mhm,
sort of thing. But they do have a problem with couple dancing. So
mm,
Mhm.
the swing or the waltz, where a man and a woman have to be partnered, and it's not, everybody of a big group
mhm,
dance, right? And of course, there is more contact involved in something like the waltz or the
right.
swing. That's clear. So they'll object to that as being
Mm,
somehow immodest and not to the line dance. Um, the response I would make to that, which we've kind of covered a little bit, is just to say, if the waltz or the swing is being done properly in a Catholic context, because there are different versions of all of these dances. There are better and worse versions
That's
of
true.
them. If they're being done well, people know what to teach, then there is not going to be any kind of of
Lasciviousness.
unacceptable,
Yes.
unacceptable intimacy. That's not
Yeah.
going to happen.
Good word.
So, did you want
No.
to add anything?
I think of a dance as a work. It's a project. It's a jigsaw puzzle. You know, I wrote this before. You might have a brother and sister trying to work at a jigsaw puzzle. You might have a brother and sister working at a dance routine. To me, it's not that different until the two people have really now they've really excelled at the dance. So it's no longer a puzzle. It's more of a work of art.
Excellent. I think that's an excellent summary. So, unless either of you have something, I think on that note, thank you to our viewers for listening 3/4 of an hour with us on this subject. And again, an important part if we're going to restore Catholic culture, Catholic Christendom, it's not just at the intellectual level, not just at the sign an agreement with all traditional doctrines, but it is actually something that affects the whole person. It's from all of our human capacities. So thank you for spending time talking about this one aspect of that. Thank you to our viewers. And as always, please consider both either subscription to our monthly newspaper or visit our premium channel on locals.com, where you can find further content available only to our subscribers. So thank both of you, Peter and Dorothy, and look forward to seeing everyone in the future.